They saw what they wanted to see. Just another bus driver on his late-night route through Millbrook. A man who'd traded his badge for a commercial license. Who'd buried his instincts to protect along with his wife and daughter 5 years ago. But on a storm-black night, when 8-year-old Talia Robinson stepped onto his bus with terror in her eyes and a desperate note in her backpack, James Carter made a choice that would expose a nightmare. In a town where corrupt officials traded children like commodities, where monsters wore suits and drove black cars through the rain, one bus driver was about to remind the shadows why good men are the most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. They thought they were hunting him. They didn't realize that with every turn through the storm, he was actually hunting them. Because sometimes justice wears a uniform no one expects, and sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil isn't a badge or a gun. It's the simple choice to stop driving past darkness and finally take a stand. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning sun barely pierced through the heavy clouds as James Carter's alarm clock shattered the silence of his modest single-story home. His hand fumbled across the nightstand, searching for the source of the noise that pulled him from another dreamless night. As his fingers found the button, the quiet returned, broken only by the eager panting of Max, his golden retriever, who stood expectantly by the bedroom door. "All right, buddy," James mumbled, his voice still rough with sleep. "Give me a minute." He swung his legs over the side of the bed, running a hand through his graying hair. At 48, James had long since settled into the comfortable routine of his life as a bus driver in the small town of Millbrook. Max's tail thumped against the doorframe as James made his way to the kitchen. The worn linoleum floor felt cold beneath his feet, a reminder that autumn was creeping in earlier than usual this year. He poured kibble into Max's bowl, the sound of dry food hitting metal mixing with the gentle whir of his coffee maker coming to life. While Max ate breakfast, James stood by his kitchen window, watching the neighbors' wind chimes dance in the morning breeze. 20 years of driving the same routes had taught him to read the sky like a book. Today's heavy clouds promised rain, and lots of it. He made a mental note to grab his heavy-duty raincoat before heading out. The coffee's rich aroma filled the kitchen as James went through his morning routine. A quick shower, a fresh uniform. Dark blue pants and a light blue button-down shirt with the Millbrook Transit Authority patch on the sleeve. He caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror, noting the deepening crow's feet around his eyes. Time had been moving differently since Sarah passed away 5 years ago, taking their daughter Emma with her in that horrible accident. Some days felt like centuries, others passed in the blink of an eye. "Be good, Max," James called out as he grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. The dog wagged his tail, already settling into his favorite spot on the couch, a habit James had given up trying to break years ago. "See you tonight, buddy." The walk to the bus depot took exactly 12 minutes, just as it had every morning for the past 2 decades. James nodded to Harold, the night shift mechanic who was just finishing up his rounds. "Everything running smooth?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Harold took pride in keeping the fleet in perfect condition. "Like a dream," Harold replied, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. "Though keep an eye on the wipers. Weather report says we're in for some heavy stuff later." James climbed aboard Bus 23, his regular vehicle for the past 3 years. He ran his hand along the familiar steering wheel, checking his mirrors with practiced precision. The leather seat creaked as he adjusted it, though it didn't really need adjusting. It was more habit than necessity at this point. The depot slowly came to life around him as other drivers arrived for their morning shifts. James watched through his windshield as Sarah Palmer, a newer driver, rushed in with her travel mug already half empty. Unlike some of the older drivers, he didn't mind the fresh faces. They reminded him that life moved forward, even when it felt like his own had stopped that rainy night 5 years ago. At exactly 6:45 a.m., James pulled out of the depot to begin his route. The streets were quiet, with only a few early morning workers waiting at the first stops. Among them was Dorothy Williams, a retired teacher who rode the bus every morning to volunteer at the local library. She smiled warmly as she boarded, using her bright purple umbrella as a walking stick. "Morning, James," she said, dropping her fare into the box with practiced ease. "Looks like we're in for some weather today." "That's what they're saying, Mrs. Williams. Better keep that umbrella handy." As the morning progressed, the bus filled with its regular passengers. The back seats were claimed by their usual occupants, a group of high school students who filled the space with laughter and the glow of their phone screens. James knew them all by sight, if not by name. The tall boy with the basketball jersey, the girl with the ever-changing hair colors, the twins who always sat together despite pretending they couldn't stand each other. The morning route went smoothly, though the threatening clouds continued to gather overhead. By noon, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the windshield in an irregular rhythm. James watched as pedestrians scurried for cover, opening umbrellas or pulling up hoods against the increasing downpour. The afternoon brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The rain grew heavier, driving most people indoors. The usual stops, that would be bustling with shoppers and office workers, were eerily empty. Even the high school students were subdued, their usual chatter replaced by the sound of rain hammering against the roof of the bus. As the day wore on, the streets began to empty. James's bus, usually full of commuters heading home, carried only a handful of passengers. Mrs. Thompson, a regular who worked at the downtown bank, sat near the front, her umbrella creating a small puddle on the floor. Behind her, Mr. Bradford dozed in his seat, his briefcase clutched protectively in his lap. The rain had turned the world outside into a gray blur, streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement like scattered stars. It was during his final route of the day that something changed. The rain had intensified, creating sheets of water that cascaded down the bus windows. James approached the old Sterling Street stop, a relic from when this part of town had been more populated. Now it stood alone, surrounded by abandoned storefronts and empty lots. He almost drove past it, assuming no one would be waiting in this weather at this forgotten corner of town. But there was someone there. Through the rain-streaked windshield, James spotted a small figure huddled beneath the rusted shelter. His first instinct was to continue driving. This wasn't a safe area for anyone, let alone what appeared to be a child. But something made him slow down, his foot easing off the accelerator as he peered through the downpour. The figure emerged from the shelter, and James's heart seemed to skip a beat. It was a young black girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. She wore clothes that didn't quite fit, an oversized sweater that hung past her knees and jeans that had been rolled up multiple times at the ankles. Her shoes were soaked through, and she clutched a worn backpack to her chest as if it contained all her worldly possessions. James pulled the bus to a stop, the brakes letting out a soft hiss as the doors opened. He expected to see a parent appear from somewhere nearby, but the street remained empty except for the small, solitary figure now stepping cautiously toward the bus. "Where are your parents, sweetheart?" James asked gently as she reached the steps. The girl's eyes darted up to meet his for just a moment before dropping back to the ground. She didn't answer, just climbed aboard with slow, deliberate movements. Water dripped from her clothes, creating tiny rivers that ran down the steps. The few remaining passengers on the bus fell silent, watching as the girl made her way to the back. Mrs. Thompson exchanged worried glances with her husband, their whispered conversation barely audible over the sound of the rain. The girl chose a seat far from everyone else, still holding her backpack like a shield. James watched her in his rearview mirror as he pulled away from the stop. Something wasn't right. He'd seen lost children before. It came with the job. But this felt different. The girl's movements were too careful, too calculated. She wasn't just lost. She was hiding. Every time they passed a parked car, he noticed her flinch slightly, her body tensing as if preparing for something. Her eyes constantly moved between the windows and the doors, checking and rechecking her surroundings. These weren't the actions of a child who had simply missed their stop or gotten on the wrong bus. These were the movements of someone who was afraid. The rain continued to pour as James drove through the darkening streets of Millbrook. In his mirror, he could see the girl's reflection, her small face illuminated briefly by passing streetlights. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, making her look older than her years. Her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the backpack straps, her knuckles white with tension. Other passengers gradually departed, each giving concerned looks toward the back of the bus as they left. Mrs. Thompson hesitated at the doors, looking back at the girl as if wanting to say something, but in the end, she just shook her head slightly and stepped out into the rain. James found himself taking the route slower than usual, watching the girl in his mirror while trying not to be obvious about it. She hadn't moved from her rigid position, hadn't relaxed her grip on the backpack. Every now and then, a small shiver would run through her body, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. The final stop was approaching, and James knew he would have to do something. He couldn't just let her stay on the bus, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His years of driving had given him a sort of sixth sense about people, and everything about this situation was setting off alarm bells in his mind. As he prepared to pull into the last stop, he noticed something sticking out of the girl's backpack. A piece of paper, partially visible where the zipper hadn't quite closed. It was crumpled and damp from the rain, but something about it caught his attention. Maybe it was the way the girl clutched the bag tighter every time she looked at it, or maybe it was just instinct. But James knew that paper was important. The bus rolled to a stop, the engine idling as the wipers continued their rhythmic movement across the windshield. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and now the girl was the only passenger left. James turned in his seat, trying to make his voice as gentle as possible. "Last stop, sweetheart. I need to know where you're heading." The girl's eyes met his in the mirror for the first time, and what he saw in them made his breath catch. Fear, yes, but also a desperate kind of determination. She didn't speak, just shook her head slightly, her fingers digging deeper into the backpack straps. That's when James made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Instead of calling dispatch or the police as regulations required, he put the bus back in drive. Something told him this girl needed help, real help, and he wasn't going to let her down. As the bus pulled away from the final stop, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was now part of something much bigger than a simple lost child case. The rain continued to pour outside, creating a barrier between them and the rest of the world, while inside the bus, two strangers found themselves bound together by circumstances neither of them could have predicted. The girl, whose name he would soon learn was Talia, remained silent in her seat, but her eyes now watched James with something new in them, the first tiny spark of hope. The rain drummed steadily against the bus roof as James guided the vehicle through Millbrook's increasingly dark streets. His decision to continue driving, past the final stop, weighed heavily on his mind, but every glance at Talia in his rearview mirror reinforced his choice. The young girl remained hunched in her seat, her backpack clutched tightly against her chest like armor. The bus's heater hummed softly, fighting against the damp chill that had settled inside. Streetlights cast intermittent shadows through the windows, briefly illuminating Talia's face before plunging it back into darkness. Her eyes darted constantly between the windows and the doors, watching, waiting. For what? James wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Are you hungry?" James asked, breaking the heavy silence. His voice, though gentle, seemed to startle her. She quickly shook her head, pressing herself further against the window. The movement caused her backpack to shift slightly, and James noticed again the corner of paper sticking out from the partially closed zipper. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Talia flinched at the sound. A barely audible whimper escaped her lips, quickly stifled as she pressed her face against her backpack. James felt his heart twist at the sound. In 20 years of driving, he'd seen all sorts of passengers, drunk teenagers, angry commuters, lost tourists. But something about this child's silent terror struck a deeper chord. The streets were nearly empty now, most people having sought shelter from the storm. Occasionally, a car would pass by, its headlights sweeping across the bus interior. Each time this happened, Talia would freeze, holding her breath until the vehicle passed. Her reaction reminded James of a documentary he'd once watched about prey animals, the way they'd go completely still when they sensed a predator nearby. A soft sob broke through the rhythm of rain and windshield wipers. James glanced in his mirror again to see Talia wiping her eyes with her oversized sleeve. She was trying so hard to be quiet, to be invisible, but her small shoulders shook with suppressed tears. "It's okay to cry," James said softly, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. Sometimes crying helps. His words seemed to break something loose in her. Talia's next sob was louder, more desperate. She pressed herself against the window as if trying to disappear into it, her tears falling freely. Now, the sound of her crying mixed with the storm outside, creating a haunting melody of pain and rain. James pulled the bus over to a well-lit stretch of road near a 24-hour diner. He needed to think, to figure out what to do next. As he shifted the bus into park, he noticed the paper in Talia's bag had worked its way further out, the corner now clearly visible under the overhead lights. "Talia," he said gently, using her name for the first time. "I want to help you, but I need to understand. What's wrong?" She looked up at the sound of her name, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. James hadn't meant to startle her, but at least she was looking at him now. Her face was streaked with tears, her dark eyes huge in her small face. "Whatever it is," he continued, "whatever you're running from, you don't have to face it alone." Talia's hands tightened on her backpack straps, her knuckles almost white with tension. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking her head violently. More tears spilled down her cheeks. The paper caught James's attention again. Something about it seemed urgent, important. Making a decision, he stood slowly from his seat, moving toward the back of the bus with deliberate, non-threatening movements. Talia watched him approach, her body tensing with each step he took. "That paper in your bag," he said, pointing to the protruding corner. "Is it something I should see?" Talia's eyes darted to her backpack, then back to James. For a long moment she sat frozen, caught between fear and desperation. Then, ever so slightly, she nodded. James reached for the paper, moving slowly to give her time to stop him if she wanted to. She didn't. Instead, she watched him with a mixture of terror and hope, her lower lip trembling. The paper was crumpled and slightly damp from the rain, but the words written on it were still clearly legible. James carefully unfolded it, his heart pounding in his chest. As he read the hastily scrawled message, he felt the world shift beneath his feet. "Help me. Don't call the police. He's watching." The words seemed to burn themselves into his mind. James read them again, then a third time, trying to process their implications. Who was watching? Why couldn't he call the police? And most importantly, what kind of danger was this child in? His hand shook slightly as he looked from the note to Talia. She had drawn her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. Her eyes were fixed on his face, watching for his reaction. "Who's watching, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Talia's reaction was immediate and violent. She shook her head frantically, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, panic evident in every movement. Okay, James said quickly, holding up his hands in a calming gesture. "You don't have to tell me right now. You're safe here." But were they safe? The words "he's watching" echoed in James's mind, taking on new meaning as he glanced out the bus windows into the rainy darkness. Someone was out there. Someone who had frightened this child so badly she'd rather trust a stranger on a bus than go home. James's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden screech of tires on wet pavement. He'd accidentally let his foot slip off the brake, causing the bus to jolt forward slightly. Talia let out a small cry of fear at the movement, her hands flying up to cover her face. The gesture was painfully familiar to James. It was the movement of someone who expected to be struck. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "It was just an accident with the brake. Nothing to be afraid of." But Talia remained tense, her breathing quick and shallow. James realized she wasn't just afraid of the sudden movement. She was afraid of him now that he'd read the note. She was waiting to see what he would do with this information. Rain continued to pour outside, creating rivers down the bus windows. The diner's neon sign cast a red glow through the glass, making the water look almost like blood. James gripped the back of a seat, steadying himself as he made a decision. He couldn't call the police. The note had been very clear about that, but he couldn't just continue driving aimlessly either. They needed a plan, a destination. Most importantly, they needed help. "Talia," he said softly, I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Do you understand? She lowered her hand slightly, peering at him through her fingers. The fear in her eyes was still there, but something else had joined it. A tiny glimmer of trust. I know someone who might be able to help us, James continued. Someone who isn't the police. Would that be okay? Talia hesitated, then gave a barely perceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it was a start. James returned to the driver's seat, his mind already plotting routes to his friend Frank's cabin. Frank was a retired cop, but more importantly, he was someone who understood that sometimes the system itself was the problem. As he put the bus back in drive, James caught movement in his side mirror, a dark figure standing in the shadow of the diner. His heart rate spiked as he watched the figure step slightly forward, revealing the outline of a tall man in dark clothing. Talia must have seen it too. A small, choked sound escaped her throat, and she pressed herself down in her seat, trying to hide below the window line. James didn't hesitate. He pressed the gas pedal, pulling away from the curb with more speed than regulation allowed. In his mirror, he could see the figure watching them leave, unmoving in the rain. The note's warning took on new urgency. He's watching. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he drove into the rainy night. Whatever was going on, whoever was after this child, they would have to go through him first. He'd failed to protect his own daughter years ago. He wouldn't fail. Talia thunder crashed overhead as the bus moved through the darkness, carrying its two passengers away from one danger and toward another. The note in James's pocket seemed to burn against his skin, its message a constant reminder of the stakes. Someone was watching, waiting, hunting. And James had just made himself part of the game. The rain grew heavier as they drove, creating a curtain of water that transformed the familiar streets of Millbrook into something alien and threatening. Each flash of lightning illuminated Talia's reflection in the windows, a small, frightened girl whose trust he now carried like a precious and fragile thing. James checked his mirrors constantly now, watching for headlights that followed too closely or cars that appeared more than once. The words from the note played on repeat in his mind, mixing with memories of his daughter Emma's laugh, of the night he'd lost her, of all the ways he'd failed to protect her. Not this time, he thought. This time would be different. But as they drove deeper into the storm-dark night, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, followed, hunted. The game had begun, and he'd just made himself a player without knowing the rules. The bus pushed forward through the rain, carrying its precious cargo toward what James hoped would be safety. But hope, he knew all too well, was a dangerous thing. Sometimes it led you to salvation, and sometimes it led you straight into a trap. The rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers marked time as James navigated the rain-slicked streets, each pass revealing a world distorted by water and fear. The bus's headlights carved yellow tunnels through the darkness, illuminating sheets of rain that seemed to glow before dissolving back into shadow. In the rearview mirror, Talia remained curled in her seat, her small form reflected in brief flashes of passing streetlights. James's mind raced as he drove, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors for signs of pursuit. The figure from the diner had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. There had been something predatory in the way the man stood, patient and still, like a spider waiting at the edge of its web. The bus approached another stop, this one nestled between two brick buildings, with a narrow alley running between them. The schedule demanded he stop here, but everything in James screamed to keep driving. Before he could decide, Talia's sharp intake of breath made the decision for him. There, in the mouth of the alley, stood a tall figure in dark clothes. Even through the rain-streaked windows, James could feel the intensity of the man's gaze fixed on the bus. The stranger's face remained in shadow, but his posture radiated a terrible kind of confidence. Talia's reaction was immediate and devastating. Her entire body went rigid, pressing back into her seat as if trying to melt through it. Her eyes, wide with terror, met James's in the mirror, and she gave a slight shake of her head, a silent, desperate plea. James didn't hesitate. Instead of slowing for the stop, he pressed down on the accelerator. The bus's engine growled in protest as they passed the alley, leaving the figure behind. But the victory felt hollow. In the mirror, James watched the man remain motionless, simply turning his head to track their passage. "That's him, isn't it?" James asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Talia nodded once, the movement so small it was barely perceptible. Then, as if the simple admission had broken something inside her, she burst into silent tears. Her whole body shook with the force of her suppressed sobs, hands pressed tightly over her mouth to muffle any sound. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please don't stop." The words hit James like a physical blow. How many times had this child begged for help? How many times had she been ignored? The steering wheel creaked under his tightening grip as rage built in his chest, not just at whoever was hunting this girl, but at every adult who had failed her. A flash of movement in his side mirror caught his attention. A black sedan pulled smoothly out of the alley they'd just passed, its headlights cutting through the rain as it merged into traffic behind them. "Damn it," James muttered, checking his mirrors again. The car maintained a careful distance, not close enough to be obvious, but definitely following. Its windshield wipers moved in steady rhythm, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. James made a sharp right turn, deviating from his regular route. The black sedan followed, matching his move with practiced ease. This was no coincidence. Whoever was driving that car knew exactly what they were doing. "Talia," James said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "I need you to stay down, okay? Don't let anyone see you through the windows." She immediately slid down in her seat, curling into a tight ball on the floor. The practiced way she moved suggested she'd done this before, another detail that made James's blood boil. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like thousands of tiny fists. James took another turn, then another, trying to lose their pursuer in the maze of Millbrook streets. But the black sedan stayed with them, a dark shadow that refused to be shaken. Through the storm, James's mind raced through options. He couldn't keep driving in circles forever. The bus would eventually need fuel, and more importantly, Talia needed real help. His thoughts turned to Frank's cabin again. It was about 30 miles outside town, isolated enough to be safe, but close enough to reach. The question was, could they make it there with this shadow on their tail? A sob from Talia broke through his thoughts. She had wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself as small as possible on the floor. Her backpack lay beside her, and something about its worn fabric and careful stitching caught James's attention. This wasn't just a school bag, it was packed for running away. How long had she been planning this escape? "You're very brave," James said softly, taking another turn to avoid a main street. "But you don't have to be brave alone anymore." Talia lifted her head slightly, her tear-stained face barely visible in the dim light. "He always finds me," she whispered. "Every time I try to run, he finds me." The words sent a chill down James's spine. Every time. How many times had this child tried to escape? How many times had she been dragged back to whatever nightmare she was fleeing? The black sedan was still there, its presence a constant threat in James's mirrors. Its driver was skilled, maintaining that same calculated distance no matter how many turns they took. This wasn't some amateur pursuit. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Lightning flashed overhead, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Talia flinched at the sound, pressing her hands over her ears. The storm was directly overhead now, turning the world outside into a chaos of wind and water. James checked his fuel gauge. They had enough to make it to Frank's cabin, but not if... They kept driving in circles. He needed to make a decision. The familiar streets of Millbrook were becoming a trap, each turn potentially leading them into a dead end where the black sedan could corner them. Another flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, and James saw his opportunity. The highway. Entrance was coming up, a chance to break free from the confined city streets. But highway meant exposure, nowhere to hide if things went wrong. The decision was made for him when he spotted a second black car pulling out from a side street ahead. This one moved with the same predatory grace as the first, its windshield tinted too dark to see the driver. "Hold on tight, Talia," James said, his voice firm as he made his choice. He turned the bus sharply onto the highway entrance ramp, the large vehicle swaying slightly with the sudden movement. The engine roared as James pressed the accelerator, pushing the bus faster than regulation allowed. Rain lashed against the windshield with increasing fury as their speed built. In his mirrors, both black cars followed, no longer bothering to maintain their discreet distance. Talia remained curled on the floor, her small body shaking with each bump and turn. Her trust in James, a stranger who had chosen to help when so many others had failed her, felt like both a gift and a terrible responsibility. The highway stretched ahead of them, a ribbon of wet asphalt disappearing into darkness. The bus's wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential rain, creating brief moments of clarity before the water closed in again. Behind them, the two black cars maintained their pursuit, their headlights burning through the storm like predatory eyes. James thought of Emma, of how he hadn't been there when she needed him most. The memory of that night, the phone call, the rain-slick roads, the horrible finality of arriving too late, threatened to overwhelm him. But this time was different. This time he was here, and he wasn't going to let another child down. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the road ahead like daylight for a brief, brilliant moment. In that flash, James saw something that made his heart skip. A third black car was waiting at the next exit ramp, its engine idling. They were being herded. The realization hit him with crushing clarity. These weren't just pursuers. They were professionals, working together to guide the bus exactly where they wanted it to go. Each turn, each decision that seemed like an escape, had been carefully calculated. James? Talia's voice was barely audible over the storm and the engine. Are they going to take me back? The fear in her voice cut through James's rising panic, replacing it with a cold, clear determination. He might be just a bus driver, but he'd spent 20 years learning every back road and hidden turn in this area. These men might be professionals, but this was his territory. No, he said firmly, his eyes fixed on the rain-dark road ahead. They're not taking you anywhere. The bus roared through the night, carrying its precious cargo deeper into the storm. Behind them, the black cars maintained their pursuit, a coordinated dance of shadows through the rain. But James had made his promise, and he intended to keep it. Whatever came next, whatever waited for them in the darkness ahead, he wouldn't let them take her. Not this time. Not this child. The last passenger besides Talia, an elderly woman named Margaret Whitaker, stood at the front of the bus, her weathered hands gripping the metal rail. Thunder crashed outside as she looked between James and the huddled form of Talia in the back, concern etched deep in the lines of her face. James, Margaret said softly, her voice trembling slightly. What's happening here? James met her eyes in the mirror, seeing the worry there, the unspoken questions. Margaret had been riding his bus for 15 years, long enough to know this. Wasn't just a simple deviation from the route. Rain hammered against the windows as he searched for the right words. Mrs. Whitaker, he said carefully, I need you to trust me right now, and I need you to forget what you've seen tonight. Margaret's eyes drifted to Talia again, understanding slowly dawning on her face. She'd been a teacher for 40 years before. Retiring, she knew the signs of a child in trouble. With a slight nod, she adjusted her purple raincoat and moved toward the door. Be careful, James, she whispered as she stepped out into the rain. Whatever this is, be careful. The bus doors hissed closed behind her, and suddenly James and Talia were alone. Through the rain-streaked windows, he watched Margaret hurry toward the shelter of a nearby shop, her umbrella battling against the wind. The three black cars remained in formation around them, one ahead, two behind, maintaining their predatory dance through the storm. Talia's backpack slid across the floor as James took another sharp turn, trying to shake their pursuers. She lunged for it immediately, clutching it back to her chest with trembling hands. Whatever was in that bag, it was clearly more than just clothes and schoolbooks. They won't stop, Talia said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the engine and rain. Not until they get what they want. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel. And what do they want, Talia? She pressed her face against her backpack, but not before James caught the flash of terror in her eyes. Me, she whispered. And what's in here? The implications of her words sent a chill down James's spine. This wasn't just about a frightened child running from abuse, though that would have been bad enough. This was something bigger, something darker. The coordinated pursuit, the professional drivers, the warning about police in Talia's note. It all pointed to something organized, something systemic. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. Emma, at 8 years old, the same age as Talia, showing him a drawing she'd made of their family. "That's you, Daddy," she'd said, pointing to a stick figure with a blue hat. "You're our protector." He hadn't protected her in the end, but maybe, just maybe he could protect Talia. Lightning split the sky as James made his decision. Instead of heading toward Frank's cabin, he turned the bus onto a narrow forest road, an old logging route he'd discovered years ago while exploring the outskirts of town. The pavement gave way to gravel, the bus's massive tires crunching over loose stones as they plunged deeper into the darkness. Branches scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers as the road narrowed. The black cars hesitated for a moment. Their sleek designs weren't made for this kind of terrain, but their pursuit resumed quickly, more aggressive now. They knew James was making a break for it. "Hold on tight," James called back to Talia as he navigated the treacherous path. The bus swayed and bounced, its suspension groaning in protest. But James knew this vehicle like he knew his own heartbeat. 20 years of driving had taught him exactly what it could handle. A fallen tree partially blocked the road ahead, its rain-slicked trunk gleaming in the headlights. Instead of stopping, James guided the bus carefully around it, using every inch of space available. The black cars would have a harder time with that obstacle. Talia had pulled herself into a seat now, her eyes wide as she watched the forest rush past outside. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere they can't follow," James replied, though he was less certain than he sounded. The storm was getting worse, making the already dangerous road even more treacherous. But they couldn't go back, not with those black cars waiting like wolves in the night. A memory flickered through James's mind, an old hunting cabin he'd spotted once while hiking these woods. It wasn't far from here, hidden away down an overgrown side trail. If they could reach it, the bus's headlights caught movement ahead, another fallen branch, this one too big to drive around. James slammed on the brakes, the bus sliding slightly on the wet gravel before coming to a stop. Behind them, headlights appeared through the trees as the black cars caught up. "Talia," James said quickly, "I need you to trust me right now. Can you do that?" She nodded, her small face set with determination despite her fear. "When I say run, I need you to run as fast as you can into those trees." He pointed to a dense patch of forest on their right. "There's a cabin about half a mile that way. I'll be right behind you." The black cars were closing in, their headlights growing brighter through the rain. Talia gripped her backpack tighter, preparing herself. James reached under his seat and grabbed the emergency flashlight. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Ready?" he asked, his hand on the door control. Talia stood, her legs shaking but her chin lifted with courage that broke James's heart. How many times had this child been forced to be brave? "Now!" James hit the door control and grabbed Talia's hand. Together they burst out of the bus and into the storm. Rain stung their faces as they ran, their feet sliding on wet leaves and mud. Behind them, car doors slammed and voices shouted. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, searching, hunting. James led Talia deeper into the woods, away from the searching lights. The darkness pressed in around them, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning that transformed the forest into a maze of twisted shadows. Their pursuers' shouts grew more distant, but James knew better than to slow down. Talia's breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, her small legs struggling to keep up. Without hesitation, James scooped her up, ignoring the protest in his aging back. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. They pushed through thick undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces. James's uniform was soaked through, his shoes squelching with every step. But he didn't slow down. He couldn't. The memory of Emma drove him forward. He hadn't been there to save his daughter, but he would be here for Talia. A gunshot cracked through the night, the sound almost lost in a roll of thunder. Talia buried her face against James's shoulder, a small whimper escaping her lips. They weren't just being chased anymore. They were being hunted. The old cabin appeared ahead, a dark shape against the darker woods. Its windows were boarded up, its roof sagging with age, but right now it looked like salvation. James carried Talia to the back of the structure, finding a half-hidden door partially covered by overgrown vines. The lock was rusted, but gave way under James's desperate strength. They stumbled inside just as another gunshot split the night. The cabin's interior was musty and cold, filled with shadows and the smell of decay, but it was shelter. James set Talia down gently, his arms shaking from the effort of carrying her. She immediately pressed herself into a corner, her backpack still clutched protectively against her chest. Rain drummed against the cabin's roof, as James quickly checked the windows, making sure they were all securely boarded. "You're bleeding," Talia whispered. James looked down to see a tear in his sleeve, blood mixing with rainwater. A branch must have caught him as they ran. He hadn't even felt it. "It's nothing," he assured her, though the cut stung now that he was aware of it. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, then froze as voices drifted through the rain. Their pursuers were getting closer. James moved to Talia's side, pulling her deeper into the shadows. His mind raced through options, none of them good. They were trapped here, and their hunters knew these woods just as well as he did. It would only be a matter of time before the cabin was discovered. "James?" Talia's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry I got you into this." He looked down at her, this brave, terrified child who had trusted him when the whole world had failed her. "Don't be sorry," he said firmly. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing." Flashlight beams swept past the boarded windows as their pursuers drew closer. James pulled Talia behind an old cabinet, trying to shield her with his body. The cabin's darkness pressed in around them, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning through the cracks in the boards. They sat in silence, listening to the footsteps approaching through the wet leaves outside. James's heart pounded so hard he was sure it must be audible. Talia's small hand found his in the darkness, squeezing it with desperate strength. The cabin door creaked, and a beam of light cut through the darkness. Their time had run out. The beam of light swept across the cabin's interior, casting grotesque shadows on the rotting walls. James pressed Talia further behind the cabinet, feeling her trembling against his back. His mind raced through options. They could try to run again, but the storm had intensified, turning the forest floor into treacherous mud. Fighting wasn't an option either. The gunshots had made it clear their pursuers were armed. A voice cut through the darkness, smooth and controlled. "We know you're in here. Let's handle this professionally." The words sent a chill down James's spine. There was something terribly wrong about how calm the man sounded, as if hunting a child through the woods was just another day at the office. Talia's grip on James's hand tightened painfully. "He's going to take me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Like he took the others." Before James could process what she meant, another flashlight beam joined the first. Two sets of footsteps moved across the cabin's creaking floorboards, methodically searching the space. "The longer this goes on," the calm voice continued, "the worse it gets for everyone, especially the girl." James felt Talia flinch at those words. The cabinet they were hiding behind wouldn't conceal them much longer. He needed to do something, anything, to get them out of this trap. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the boarded windows, briefly illuminating the cabin's interior. In that split second, James spotted something he'd missed before: a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden under a moldy rug. An old root cellar, maybe, or a storage space. "Last chance," the voice called out. "Come out now, and we can all walk away from this." James knew it was a lie. Men like this didn't let witnesses walk away. He squeezed Talia's hand once, then carefully reached for a piece of broken wood lying nearby. The footsteps were getting closer, the beams of light systematically eliminating their hiding spots. With all his strength, James hurled the wood through one of the boarded windows. The crash of splintering wood coincided perfectly with another thunderclap. Both flashlight beams instantly swung toward the noise. "Go!" James hissed, pushing Talia toward the trapdoor. She moved silently, her small hands quickly finding the iron ring and pulling. The hinges protested softly, but the storm's fury masked the sound. Just as Talia disappeared into the darkness below, a flashlight beam cut across James's face. Got him. James didn't hesitate. He dove through the trapdoor, pulling it shut above him just as footsteps pounded across the cabin floor. The space below was pitch black and smelled of damp earth. He felt Talia's presence beside him, her breathing, quick but controlled. "There's a tunnel," she whispered, her hand finding his in the darkness. "I can feel it." She was right. James's outstretched hand found rough-hewn walls extending into the darkness. The passage was narrow but tall enough for him to crouch walk. An old bootlegger's tunnel, maybe, or part of the Underground Railroad. Whatever it was their only chance. Above them, heavy footsteps circled the trapdoor. "Find it! They have to be down there!" James urged Talia forward into the tunnel. They moved as quickly as they dared, feeling their way through the absolute darkness. The earthen walls pressed in around them, occasionally dripping cold water down their necks. Behind them, the sound of the trapdoor being wrenched open echoed through the passage. "How much does he know?" James whispered, as they hurried through the darkness. "About what's in your bag?" "Everything," Talia replied, her voice tight with fear. "That's why he won't stop. I took the proof." The tunnel took a sharp turn, then began to slope upward. Fresh air touched James's face. They had to be nearing an exit. Behind them, flashlight beams bounced off the tunnel walls, accompanied by the sound of pursuit. The passage ended abruptly at a pile of collapsed earth. James's heart sank until his probing hands found metal rungs embedded in the wall, a ladder leading up to what felt like a wooden hatch. "You first," he told Talia, helping her onto the ladder. She climbed quickly while James kept watch, the pursuers' lights growing brighter. As soon as Talia was through the hatch, James followed, pulling himself up into rain and wind. They emerged in a small clearing, the storm still raging overhead. Through the trees, James could see lights on the main road. They'd traveled further than he'd thought. His bus was probably still where they'd left it, blocking the narrow forest path. "Run for the road," James said, but Talia suddenly grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "Listen." Through the storm, an engine growled, not from the direction of the bus but from the road ahead. Another black car was waiting for them. "He knew," Talia said, her voice hollow with despair. "He knew about the tunnel." The hatch behind them burst open, flashlight beams cutting through the rain. They were trapped between the men in the tunnel and whoever waited on the road. James made a split-second decision. "Hold on to me," he told Talia. When she wrapped her arms around his neck, he turned away from both the road and the tunnel, plunging instead down the steep hillside that fell away to their right. They half ran, half slid down the muddy slope, James using trees to control their descent. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he didn't slow down. He could hear their pursuers crashing through the undergrowth behind them. The hill ended at a swift-moving stream, swollen with rainwater. Under normal circumstances, trying to cross it would be suicide. But these weren't normal circumstances. "Take a deep breath," James warned Talia. Then he waded in. The current immediately tried to pull them under, the cold water stealing James's breath. But he fought against it, keeping Talia's head above water as they pushed toward the far bank. Behind them, voices shouted in frustration. They emerged on the other side, soaked and shivering but alive. Through the trees, James could see the lights of civilization. They'd come out near the old Miller farm. If they could reach it. A gunshot cracked through the storm. James felt something hot graze his shoulder and Talia screamed. He ran harder, zigzagging between trees to make them harder targets. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he forced himself to keep moving. The farmhouse's lights grew closer. James knew old Tom Miller. He'd been riding the bus into town every Tuesday for years. If they could just reach him. Another shot rang out, this one splintering bark off a tree near James's head. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root, but managed to keep his balance. Talia clung to him like a lifeline, her face pressed against his shoulder. Through the rain, James caught a glimpse of movement on the road above, headlights moving fast. For a moment, his heart sank, thinking it was another black car. Then, he recognized the familiar shape of the vehicle, and hope surged through him. It was Frank's truck. His old friend must have gotten worried when James didn't show up at the cabin. Frank had come looking for them, and not a moment too soon. The truck skidded to a stop on the road above, and Frank's voice boomed through the storm. "James! Down here!" Another shot rang out, but this time it came from Frank's position. The retired cop might have been forced off the force, but he hadn't lost his skills. The pursuing footsteps behind them suddenly became more cautious. James's legs were ready to give out as he climbed the last few feet up to the road. Frank's truck idled there, its engine running, the passenger door already open. Without hesitation, James lifted Talia into the cab, then pulled himself in after her. "Go!" he gasped, and Frank floored the accelerator. The truck's tires spun in the mud for a heart-stopping moment before finding purchase. As they sped away, James looked back through the rain-streaked window. Dark figures emerged from the trees, watching them leave. No shots followed them. Perhaps even they weren't bold enough to risk hitting a vehicle driven by a former police officer. Talia sat between them, still clutching her backpack, her whole body shaking with cold and fear. James pulled her close, trying to share what little warmth he had left. "It's okay," he told her, though he knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "You're safe now." Frank's eyes met his in the rearview mirror, full of questions that would need answers soon. But for now, they drove in silence through the storm, leaving the dark figures and their secrets behind in the rain-soaked forest. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness ahead, leading them toward what James hoped would be sanctuary. But as he held Talia's trembling form, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever secrets that backpack held, whatever darkness they'd stumbled into, it was far from over. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating Frank's grim expression. The retired cop's hands were tight on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors for pursuit. He knew, just as James did, that men like their pursuers didn't give up easily. They would regroup, plan, and come again. But for now they had won a small victory. They had kept Talia safe, kept her out of those cruel hands for one more night. And tomorrow they would figure out exactly what they were dealing with and how to end it once and for all. Frank's cabin emerged from the darkness like a fortress, its sturdy walls promising safety after the terror of their escape. The building sat alone at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by towering pines that swayed and groaned in the wind. As Frank's truck ground to a halt, the headlights illuminated a collection of security cameras mounted discreetly under the eaves. This was no ordinary hunting retreat. James helped Talia from the truck, noting how she still clutched her backpack despite her exhaustion. Her clothes were soaked through, her small frame shivering against the cold. Frank led them quickly to the door, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency as he disabled the security system and ushered them inside. The cabin's interior was spare but comfortable, lit by warm lamplight that chased away the shadows of their pursuit. A wood stove radiated heat from one corner, and the walls were lined with books and old photographs. But James didn't miss the gun safe by the door, or the multiple locks on the windows. Frank had prepared this place for trouble. "Bathroom's down the hall," Frank said, his gravelly voice gentler than usual as he addressed Talia. "There are clean towels and some old clothes that might fit you in the cabinet. Get warm and dry, okay?" Talia looked to James for confirmation. When he nodded, she disappeared down the hallway, her wet shoes leaving small puddles on the hardwood floor. As soon as she was out of earshot, Frank turned to James, his lined face tight with concern. "What the hell did you just drag into my house, old friend?" James sank into a chair by the wood stove, his muscles screaming from the night's exertion. "Honestly, Frank, I'm still trying to figure that out myself." He recounted the events of the evening, finding Talia at the bus stop, discovering the note, the pursuit through the storm. Frank listened without interruption, but his expression grew darker with each detail. "Armed men hunting a child," Frank muttered, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass and handing it to James. "Professional pursuit tactics, and that warning about the police." He shook his head. "This isn't some simple custody dispute." "She said something back there," James added, his voice low, "about him taking others. And whatever's in that backpack, she said she took proof. Frank's hand reflexively touched the holster at his hip, a habit from his police days. Proof of what? Before James could answer, Talia's voice came from the hallway. Proof that they're selling us. She stood in the doorway, swimming in one of Frank's old flannel shirts that hung to her knees. Her hair was wrapped in a towel, but her face held none of the innocence an 8-year-old should. Her eyes were old, haunted by things no child should know. What do you mean selling? James asked, though his heart already knew the answer. Talia moved to sit by the wood stove, her hand still gripping her backpack. Mr. Reed, my foster father, he works with bad people. They pretend to help kids like me, but they're really looking for ones nobody will miss. The words hung in the sow, air like poison. Frank's face had gone pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I heard them talking one night, Talia continued, her voice barely above a whisper, about prices and shipping dates, about which kids would sell best overseas. She pulled her backpack closer. So I took his laptop, and his papers, all the, proof. James felt sick. The coordinated pursuit, the professional hunters, the warning about police, it all made horrible sense now. This wasn't just about one corrupt foster parent. This was organized crime, hiding behind a system meant to protect children. Frank had started pacing, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. How high does it go? He demanded. How many people are involved? Judges, Talia said quietly. Police. People who can make kids disappear into the system. Mr. Reed said nobody would believe me because they own everyone who matters. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He stopped pacing, his face a mask of pain and rage. 5 years ago, he said, more to himself than to James, I was investigating missing foster kids. Pattern of disappearances, all through the same channels. But every lead went cold. Every witness backed out. Then suddenly I'm forced into early retirement, told to forget what I'd seen. They're going to kill us, aren't they? Talia's voice was steady, too steady for a child facing such horror. No, James and Frank said simultaneously. Frank knelt in front of Talia, his expression fierce with determination. Listen to me, sweetheart. What you did was incredibly brave. You've given us a chance to stop these monsters, to save other kids like you. But I need to know exactly what's in that bag. Talia hesitated, then slowly unzipped her backpack. She pulled out a laptop, its silver, case scratched and dented, and a thick manila envelope stuffed with documents. Names, she said. Dates, bank accounts, pictures of the kids they took. Her hands trembled slightly. Mr. Reed likes to keep records. He said it was insurance in case anyone tried to betray him. Frank examined the documents with professional precision, his face growing grimmer with each page. This is enough to bring down their whole operation. Names of buyers, corrupt officials, transport routes. He looked up at James. This is what they were willing to kill for. Thunder rolled outside as James absorbed the magnitude of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about saving one child anymore, though that would have been reason enough. This was about exposing a cancer that had infected the very systems meant to protect the vulnerable. We can't go to the police, Frank said, voicing what they were all thinking. Not until we know who's clean and who's compromised. But I know someone, a journalist named Amanda Pierce. She broke the story on that corruption scandal in the DA's office last year. She's got contacts in the FBI, people we can trust. How do we reach her? James asked. She's got a safe house in the city, but getting there. Frank glanced at the window where rain still lashed against the glass. They'll be watching every road. They're not watching for a bus, James said slowly, an idea forming. My route goes right past her neighborhood. A bus driver and his daughter, heading to work. Who'd look twice? Talia's head snapped up at the word daughter, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. James reached out and took her hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. First light, Frank decided. I'll make some calls, get things ready. But for now, he looked at Talia with genuine tenderness. You need sleep, little warrior. You're safe here. James led Talia to the spare bedroom, where Frank had already turned down the covers. The room was small but secure, with heavy curtains and a reinforced door. As he helped her into bed, she suddenly grabbed his arm. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You could have just kept driving." James thought of Emma, of all the times he'd wished someone had been there to help her. "Because it was right," he said simply, "and because you're not alone anymore." Talia's grip on his arm loosened as exhaustion finally overcame her. Within moments, her breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep. James watched her for a moment, marveling at how this child had shown more courage in one night than most adults would in a lifetime. Back in the main room, Frank was cleaning his service weapon with mechanical precision. "You know what this means," he said without looking up. "If we do this, if we expose them, they'll come at us with everything they have." James thought of the armed men in the forest, of the corruption reaching into the highest levels of power. He thought of Talia, sleeping fitfully in the next room, and all the other children still trapped in this nightmare. "Then they better bring their best," he said quietly. "Because we're not backing down." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, three unlikely allies prepared for a different kind of warfare. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, they had won this night. They had kept Talia safe, and with her, the evidence that could bring down an empire built on stolen innocence. Frank finished with his weapon and looked up at James. "You know, when you retired from the force to drive a bus, I thought you were wasting your life. And now? Now I think maybe you were exactly where you needed to be." James thought of all the random choices that had led to this moment. His career, change, his route, the storm that had brought Talia to his bus. Maybe none of it was random at all. "Get some rest," Frank said, moving to take first watch. "Tomorrow, we start a war." First light crept over the horizon, painting the storm clouds in shades of gray and purple. The rain had finally stopped, but water still dripped from the trees surrounding Frank's cabin, each drop echoing like a tiny gunshot in the pre-dawn silence. Inside, James watched as Frank methodically laid out their plan on his kitchen table. "Amanda's safe house is here," Frank said, pointing to a spot on a worn map. "Your regular route passes within 2 blocks, but Reed knows that route. He's been watching long enough to learn your patterns." James nodded, his hand absently touching the bandage on his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. "So we give him what he expects. Make him think he's got us cornered." "Exactly." Frank's weathered face was grim with determination. "The bus broke down here, in the industrial district. Minimal witnesses, plenty of cover. Perfect spot for an ambush." Talia sat quietly at the table, wearing clean clothes Frank had picked up from a nearby store at dawn. Her backpack rested against her chair, containing the evidence that could bring down Reed's entire operation. The laptop and documents were now secured in a waterproof case, protected against whatever might come. "You don't have to be there," James told her softly. "We can find another way." Talia shook her head, her jaw set with determination that broke his heart. "He won't believe it's real unless I'm there. He knows I wouldn't let the proof out of my sight." She was right, of course. Reed knew Talia, knew her habits, her fears, her determination. The trap would only work if she played her part. Frank checked his watch. "We need to move. Sun's coming up, and we want to be in position before rush hour." The drive to the disabled bus was tense with anticipation. James sat in the back of Frank's truck with Talia, while Frank navigated the empty morning streets. They had left fake signs of a hasty departure at the cabin. Muddy footprints, an open first aid kit, food taken from the cupboards. Everything to suggest they had fled in panic. The bus sat where they had left it the night before, its massive form blocking most of the narrow forest road. James felt a pang of guilt. He'd never abandoned his route before. But some things were more important than schedules. "Remember," Frank said as they prepared, "Reed's arrogant. He thinks he owns this town. We use that against him." James helped Talia onto the bus, trying not to think about how young she looked in the early morning light. She took her position in the back, visible through the windows, but protected by the reinforced glass Frank had installed hours earlier. Frank disappeared into the trees with his rifle, finding a position that gave him a clear view of the approach. James sat in the driver's seat, his hands resting on the familiar wheel. Now they waited. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of the storm. Birds began their morning songs, oblivious to the tension below. James checked his mirror, constantly, watching Talia and the road behind them. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning silence. 2 black cars appeared first, moving slowly down the forest road. Then a third pulled up from the opposite direction, blocking any escape route. They had taken the bait. "Stay calm," James said softly, knowing Talia could hear him. Just like we planned. The cars stopped, and doors opened with precise synchronization. Men in dark suits emerged, moving with professional grace. But James's attention was fixed on the figure emerging from the lead car, a tall man in an expensive coat, his silver hair immaculate despite the humid morning air. "Mr. Reed," James called out, playing his part. "We don't want any trouble." "Thomas," Reed smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "A bit late for that, wouldn't you say?" He gestured to the armed men surrounding the bus. "You've taken something that belongs to me. Several things, actually." James stood from his seat, making sure to appear nervous but defiant. "She's not property." None of them were. Property, merchandise, inventory. The terminology doesn't matter. Reed's voice was smooth, reasonable, as if discussing a business transaction. "What matters is resolving this situation professionally. You're in over your head, Mr. Carter. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," James replied, his anger no longer an act. "A man who sells children, who turns a system meant to protect them into a hunting ground." Reed's smile widened slightly. "Ah, idealism. How refreshing." He took a step closer to the bus. "But let's be practical. You can't run. My men have every exit covered. The police won't help. Most of them work for me. And your friend in the trees with the rifle, he's outnumbered and outgunned." A flash of surprise crossed James's face before he could hide it. Reed laughed softly. "Please. Did you think I wouldn't have thermal imaging? Your former Officer Wells isn't as clever as he thinks he is." Reed raised his voice. "You can come out now, Frank. Let's handle this like professionals." There was a moment of tense silence, then Frank emerged from the trees, his rifle held carefully at his side. 3 of Reed's men immediately trained their weapons on him. "You should have stayed retired," Reed said conversationally. "Enjoying your pension, playing with your grandchildren. Instead, you're going to die in these woods, all because you couldn't let go of a failed investigation." "Not failed," Frank replied, his voice steady. "Just delayed." Reed sighed theatrically. "Enough of this. Talia, come here, bring the backpack, and I'll consider letting these 2 live." James watched in the mirror as Talia stood, her small face set with determination. She walked slowly to the front of the bus, her backpack clutched tightly against her chest. "That's it," Reed called encouragingly. "You know running is pointless. You know what happens to people who defy me." Talia reached the bus steps, her hand resting on the rail. Then she spoke, her voice clear and strong in the morning air. "I know what happened to Sophie." Reed's smile faltered for the first time. "What?" "And Maria, and Daniel, and all the others." Talia's voice grew stronger with each name. "It's all in your files. Every sale, every transport, every child you erased. You don't know what you're talking about," Reed snapped, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "The laptop wasn't the only copy," Talia continued. "Everything was uploaded last night. Time-delayed emails to newspapers, TV stations, the FBI. If anything happens to us, it all goes public." Reed's composure cracked. "You're lying." "Check your phone," Frank said calmly. "I'm sure your contacts are already calling." As if on cue, Reed's phone began to ring. He pulled it out, his face draining of color as he read the screen. "Sir," one of his men called urgently. "We've got multiple vehicles approaching. News vans, FBI." Reed's control shattered. "Kill them. Kill them. All!" The next few moments were chaos. Gunshots rang out, but not from Reed's men. Amanda Pierce's security team, former Special Forces operators she'd hired to protect her investigations, emerged from their hidden positions around the clearing. "Federal agents!" A voice boomed through a megaphone. Drop your weapons. Reed turned to run, but James was faster. He burst from the bus, tackling the man who had caused so much pain. They hit the ground hard, Reed's expensive coat getting soaked in the mud. You're finished, James growled, pinning him down. The system you corrupted is going to destroy you. Reed started to laugh, a horrible, broken sound. You think this ends with me? There are others, networks within networks. You have no idea how deep it goes. Maybe not, James admitted, hearing sirens approaching in the distance. But we know where it starts. And you're going to tell us everything. The clearing filled with federal agents and SWAT teams. Reed's men surrendered, dropping their weapons as news helicopters circled overhead. Amanda Pierce herself strode through the chaos, her camera crew documenting everything. Frank helped James up, both men watching as Reed was led away in handcuffs. We did it, Frank said quietly. After all these years. But James was already moving toward the bus, where Talia stood on the steps. She launched herself into his arms as he approached, burying her face in his shoulder. It's over, he whispered, holding her tight. It's really over. What happens now? She asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. James looked at the rising sun, at the news crews documenting the beginning of Reed's empire's fall, at Frank, talking with federal agents about years of investigation finally bearing fruit. Now, he said softly, we go home. The morning light grew stronger, burning away the last shadows of the long night. In the distance, more sirens approached, not in pursuit this time, but coming to help, to witness, to begin the long process of justice. Talia's grip on James tightened. Promise you won't leave? Never, he replied, and in that moment, he knew it was true. Whatever came next, investigations, trials, the slow process of healing, they would face it together. The nightmare was over. The morning had come at last. The courthouse steps gleamed in the autumn sunlight, polished by the feet of hundreds who had gathered to witness justice unfold. 3 months had passed since that stormy night when a bus driver and a brave little girl had cracked open one of the largest trafficking rings in the country's history. Now, on this crisp October morning, Thomas Reed sat in the defendant's box, his expensive suit unable to hide the defeat in his posture. James Carter adjusted his tie, a new one Talia had helped him pick out for the trial, as he watched Reed from the gallery. The man who had once seemed so powerful now looked small, diminished by the weight of his exposed crimes. Beside James, Talia sat straight-backed in her new dress, her eyes never leaving her former foster father. The defendant will rise, the judge announced, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. This wasn't just any judge. This was Justice Sarah Montgomery, specially appointed after half the local judiciary had been implicated in Reed's network. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, and more importantly, she was incorruptible. Reed stood slowly, his chains clinking in the silence. The evidence against him had been overwhelming. Talia's stolen files had been just the beginning. Once the FBI started pulling threads, the whole tapestry of corruption had unraveled. Judges, police officers, social workers, dozens of officials who had helped Reed traffic children through the foster system. Before I pass sentence, Justice Montgomery said, her stern gaze fixed on Reed. Would the defendant like to make a statement? Reed's lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head. When he spoke, his voice had lost its smooth confidence. You think this ends with me? He turned slightly, his cold eyes finding Talia in the crowd. There will always be others. Always be children no one wants, no one believes. That's enough. The judge cut him off sharply. Mr. Reed, you stand convicted of human trafficking, child exploitation, conspiracy, and numerous other charges. The evidence presented in this court has exposed not just your crimes, but a systemic failure to protect our most vulnerable citizens. She paused, letting her words sink in. In the gallery, Frank Wells sat forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped together. The former cop had spent the past months working tirelessly with the FBI task force, his old investigation finally bearing fruit. Throughout this trial, Justice Montgomery continued, We have heard testimony from countless brave survivors, children who found the courage to speak truth to power. But none showed more courage than young Talia Robinson, who risked everything to expose your operation. Talia's small hand found James's, squeezing it tight. He squeezed back, remembering all the nightmares, all the therapy sessions, all the small victories that had brought them to this moment. Thomas Reed, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Furthermore, all your assets will be seized and placed in a trust for your victims. The judge's gavel came down with finality. Get him out of my courtroom. As Reed was led away, Amanda Pierce stood from her seat in the press section, her camera crew capturing every moment. Her series of exposés had won her a Pulitzer nomination, but more importantly, they had sparked nationwide reform of the foster care system. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around them, shouting questions. Frank moved protectively in front of Talia, shielding her from the cameras, but she touched his arm gently, shaking her head. It's okay, she said. I want to speak. The microphones dropped to her level as she stepped forward. Gone was the terrified child from that rainy night. In her place stood a survivor, her voice clear and strong. To any other kids out there who are scared, who think no one will believe them, there are people who will listen, people who will help. She looked up at James, her eyes bright with tears and determination. Sometimes heroes drive buses. The headlines the next day would focus on Reed's sentencing, on the continuing investigations, on the systemic changes being implemented. But it was Talia's words that resonated across the country, reaching into dark places where other children waited, hoping for rescue. That evening, James drove his regular route for the first time in weeks. The bus felt different now, not just a vehicle, but a symbol of hope. At each stop, he found himself watching more carefully, looking for signs he might have missed before. He wasn't the only one. Across the country, other drivers, teachers, and ordinary citizens were learning to recognize the signs of trafficking, creating a network of vigilant eyes. Frank had been offered his old job back, with a promotion to head a new task force dedicated to investigating trafficking rings. He'd accepted on one condition, that he could work part-time, leaving his afternoons free to coach Little League. Talia had joined the team, her natural athletic ability surprising everyone except James, who had seen her determination firsthand. As James pulled the bus into its final stop for the day, he spotted two familiar figures waiting. Talia stood with her new backpack, this one filled with normal school books and sports equipment instead of evidence, while Frank chatted with some of the other parents nearby. How was practice? James asked as Talia bounded up the steps. I hit a home run, she announced proudly. Coach Frank says I have a natural swing. That's my girl. The words came naturally now, warming his heart every time he said them. The adoption papers had been finalized just last week, making official what they had both known since that first night. They were family. They drove home together, Talia chattering about her day while Frank followed in his truck. The evening sun painted the streets gold, transforming the familiar route into something magical. Other passengers smiled at Talia's enthusiasm, many of them regulars who had followed their story in the news. Their small house looked different too, brightened by Talia's presence, filled with the sound of laughter that James had thought he'd never hear again after losing Emma. Max, his golden retriever, greeted them at the door with enthusiastic tail wags, having fully adopted Talia as his new favorite human. Later that night, after dinner and homework and Frank's traditional evening check-in, James tucked Talia into bed. Her room had been transformed from a spare storage space into a child sanctuary, complete with sports posters and a small desk where she worked on her new passion, writing stories about brave kids who fought against injustice. Dad? She asked, as he turned to leave, the words still new and precious between them. Do you think there are still other kids out there, like I was? James sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. Yes, sweetheart, I think there are. But there are also more people looking out for them now, because of you. More people paying attention, asking questions, refusing to look away. She nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question he knew had been bothering her. Do you think Emma would have liked me? James felt tears prick at his eyes. Oh, honey, she would have loved you. You're both so brave, so determined to help others. He kissed her forehead gently. You know, sometimes I think she led me to you that night, like she knew you needed help, and made sure I was there. Talia smiled at that, snuggling deeper under her covers. Tell me about her, the happy stories. So James sat in the soft lamplight, sharing memories of another brave little girl who had once filled his life with joy. He told Talia about Emma's first bicycle ride, her love of chocolate ice cream, the way she used to sing off-key in the shower. As he spoke, he felt the two pieces of his heart, the daughter he had lost and the daughter he had found, beginning to heal together. A soft knock at the door interrupted his stories. Frank stood there, his face serious, but not alarmed. Just got word from the FBI task force, he said quietly. They've identified another ring operating out of Chicago. Amanda's already on her way there. James nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. Their work wasn't over. Wouldn't be over as long as there were children being bought and sold in the shadows. But now they had a network, a system for fighting back. Regular people working together, refusing to let darkness win. Will you have to go? Talia asked, sitting up in bed. Just for a few days, Frank assured her. Someone needs to train the local bus drivers, teach them what to look for. Your dad's become quite the expert instructor. James smiled at that. He'd spoken at several police academies and driver training programs, sharing his experience, teaching others the signs he'd noticed that night, small details that could save lives, a child's flinch, a too tight grip on a backpack, eyes that constantly searched for danger. But I'll be back for your game on Saturday, he promised Talia. Wouldn't miss it for the world. She lay back down, satisfied. Good, because I'm going to hit another home run. After she fell asleep, James and Frank sat on the front porch sharing a quiet moment as crickets chirped in the darkness. The wind carried a hint of autumn chill, reminding them of that stormy night that had changed everything. You know, Frank said thoughtfully, when Sarah and Emma died, I was worried about you, thought you'd never find your way back to living. James watched the stars emerging above them, bright points of light in the darkness. I didn't think I would either, but sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes those plans involve picking up strays, Frank chuckled, referring to both Talia and Max, who had settled at their feet. Sometimes they involve retired cops who keep their rifle skills sharp, James countered with a smile. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The night was peaceful, but they both knew that somewhere, other children waited in darkness, hoping for rescue. The fight would continue, but they weren't alone anymore. Inside, Talia slept soundly, her dreams no longer haunted by shadows. Her story had sparked a movement, awakening a nation to horrors that had festered in secret for too long. But more importantly, she had found what every child deserves: safety, love, and a family who would move heaven and earth to protect her. The next morning, James would drive his route again, his eyes always watching, always alert. Talia would go to school, then baseball practice, living the normal life she had been denied for so long. Frank would head to Chicago, carrying their hard-won knowledge to others who needed it. And somewhere in the darkness, a child would be waiting, holding on to hope. But now there were people watching, listening, ready to help. Sometimes they drove buses, or coached Little League, or wrote news stories that shook the world. Sometimes, James thought as he headed inside for the night, heroes looked just like regular people, doing what needed to be done. Sometimes courage wore a bus driver's uniform, or a child's oversized sweater, or a retired cop's familiar jacket. And sometimes, love grew in the most unexpected places, healing wounds you thought would never mend. The porch light cast a warm glow as James locked up for the night, listening to the quiet sounds of his daughter's peaceful breathing from down the hall. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles in their ongoing war against darkness. But tonight, in this moment, all was right in their small corner of the world. A family forged in storm and struggle, bound together by courage and love, safe under the stars that had guided them home. What would you have done in James's position that rainy night? When was the last time you chose to stand up instead of drive past? If this story touched you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful tales of everyday heroes who remind us that the greatest acts of courage often start with the smallest choices. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Until then, keep your eyes open and your heart brave, because you never know when you might be someone's only chance at salvation.